So today we're going to be looking at the evolution of one clade that we know relatively very well, humans. And what I want us to do is to look at that clade as an example on how a species evolve into multiple things, and that evolution is something that is happening not only through time but also through space. And when you get many species doing exactly the same thing, what you ended up with is this overlap on the ranges of a species that then results in these patterns that are the focus of biogeography. So let's just review very quickly though something that I mentioned earlier about how do you go from one species to another, to two others, which is called speciation. I made a mistake in the last lecture to say that there were three processes when there are clearly four of them, four different mechanisms in which you go from one species to the other, from one species to two. And we define them as allopatric speciation. Basically what happens in these mechanisms, you get a barrier, the populations get separated. As a result of this separation, these populations will try to adapt, and if that separation happens for enough time, if those populations were to come upon contact again, they will not reproduce. As a result, you go from one species to two via allopatric speciation. Peripatric and parapatric speciation are relatively similar versions of speciation in which you get a population that is established to the periphery of the ancestral population. In the case of peripatric speciation, the population that is created on the periphery is completely isolated, but in parapatric there is still some connectivity. The end result of these two pathways, again, is that you ended up having two species at the end. And then finally we have sympathetic speciation, in which you go from one to two species, that process happening exactly in the same place. Now, when we talk about speciation though, how do you go from one species to another to two? The key question there is how fast that process happened. Darwin originally suggested that that process of going from one to two was a gradual process. It's something that happens over very long evolutionary time scales in something that he defines as gradual adaptation model. However, Darwin was kind of puzzled though, in the sense that there were not really a lot of fossils to document that entire progression of you going from one species to two. According to the gradual adaptation model, you will expect to see some very nice transitions from this one species to two, and that should be reflected in the fossil record. However, those intermediate states were not available. Darwin speculated that they were there, we just haven't found them, or perhaps many of them were already lost. But Darwin suggested that you go from one to two via this gradual progression on the process of evolution. However, in 1972, an alternative idea was suggested, which is the fact that these changes from one species to the other to two are things that happen very quickly in something that is called punctuated equilibrium model, and it was introduced by these two guys here, Niles Eldridge and Gould. And they suggest it's not that the fossils are not there, it's that those fossils don't exist at all. Basically, you go from one species to two via a very fast evolution. Unfortunately, well, there was this other guy, Richard Dawkins, that kind of challenged the idea of the punctuated equilibrium, and these guys went at each other for many years. Actually, this debate lasted for several decades, and at the end of the day, we kind of settled to believe that the two mechanisms of speciation are correct. There are times in which you are going to have the conditions and the taxa that allows for a process of a speciation that is gradual, when in other cases you might have fast environmental changes, as an example, that could lead to very fast evolution of a species. So again, despite the fact that there was a debate and it still is not resolved today, it's rather believed that whether you get a gradual or punctuated model of speciation is a function of the taxa that you are studying. Now let's look at again a case example of this process of speciation on us humans. So there is obviously, according to Darwin, we all come from a common ancestor, and we're still debating what that common ancestor is for us. However, when you start building the human phylogeny, you find that there were several milestones that were important, again, for us to diversify or to differentiate ourselves from our ancestors. Like, for instance, one key milestone in our evolution was that we started to walk, and that did happen about 6 million years ago. The evidence that we had to suggest that we kind of went from lying that sitting or walking on 4 feet to 2 is this guy here. Is a fossil that was discovered in 2001 in Africa. That fossil was described in a paper in the journal Nature. That right there is a Nature. You're gonna see through this, as I described the human phylogeny, how every fossil that has been discovered as it relates to us has been published normally in journals like Nature and Science, which are the top journals in the world. Again, just to highlight the significance of those discoveries, because every time that one of those fossils is discovered, normally what happens is that we change the way that we know our own history. So you are gonna see very common how these milestones that allow us to define our actual phylogeny are actually published commonly on very high profile journals. In this case, mostly it's just lucky discoveries of these people. Another interesting discovery was this fossil over here, 1995, a fossil that was discovered in Africa in 1995, again in Kenya. And again, the paper, no surprise, got published in the journal Nature. That now is very strong evidence that by 4.1 million years ago, we were already standing in 2 legs. And obviously, the significance of us standing in 2 legs is that now it allows us to run faster. Maybe we were being chased by an animal, and it allows us to do a lot of different things, and that kind of took our evolutionary pathway in a completely different way of how we were before. Now, 2.6 billion years ago, it was the dawn of technology. That's the first evidence now that humans have started to use tools. And you can imagine the significance of this milestone in our evolutionary history, when now we can get access beyond our own organs and body to do things, you know. So that turned out to be a huge milestone 2.6 million years ago when we started to use tools. Then 0.8 million years ago, we had this guy here, the control of fire. That was huge. For us to get control over fire, that kind of sets us apart from every species that we know in the world. One of the significant things of having control over fire is that obviously it will allow us to be safe. It will allow us to be safe at night. Critically though, the control of fire, what it gave us is the capacity to cook. You might not think much about cooking, but it turns out that having control over fire now gives us access to a complete different set of diets. Now we could eat food that we can digest faster. And in fact, one of the interesting modifications in the human body as a result of us having control over fire was the fact that our intestines became shorter. So that is interesting. And again, now we don't have to spend too much time foraging to find food or to process the food, when we can easily now get access to quick food. So this one was huge. Another interesting transformation in our body around the same time was the fact that our brain became bigger, and that obviously gave us a huge competitive advantage compared to many other species. There is still a huge debate about why our brain got to be so big. So one speculation is the fact that now with us having access to different types of diets, we had more energy to fuel that humongous brain that we were to have now, although that hypothesis is controversial, although some evidence suggests very strongly that that's the reason for why we had such a big brain, that we now had the capacity to process food faster. And finally, about 10,000 years ago, we domesticated plants and animals, and that led us to who we are today, Homo sapiens. Again, a species that was described, the first species that was ever described according to the Linnaeus system in 1756, and we got to be everywhere. So that generally speaks about the milestones in our evolution. However, there have been several interesting discoveries through time, right? Like for instance, this discovery about a species called Lucy. That species was discovered in 1974, and it was published in the journal Nature Science in 1979. And it suggests that perhaps there is a completely different lineage for the evolution of humans. So it turns out that humans, we kind of branch out earlier on evolution, and there was another group of species that look like us that branch in a completely different pathway. So this one fossil kind of broke into the phylogeny of humans, and the name of the fossil is called Lucy. You Google that guy, that name is actually pretty famous in the fossil record. Another interesting discovery in the phylogeny of human is that perhaps there was a different ancestor for our own pathway across our phylogeny. And was this guy here called Australopithecus cevida that was discovered actually very recently in 2010. It was found in South Africa. It made it to Science, and not only in Science, but it got the cover of Science. And again, the significance of this one finding here is the fact that it led to a completely different ancestor. Perhaps another cool discovery is this one guy here called RD. This is a fossil, again, that was discovered not too long ago in 2009 that suggests that the origins of the branch that led to humans is perhaps much earlier than what we thought earlier. This was a discovery that made it all over the news around the world. Another interesting discovery is this guy here called Ida. This discovery is a fossil that was published in 2009, and it's super interesting because this one species was framed. Somebody bought the fossil, put it on a house, and it was framed there for many years until somebody came along and saw it, and he realized that this was actually the missing link. So when you look at the whole evolution of humans, we are still missing that fossil that will attach us to the rest of evolution of a species in the world, and that's what is called the missing link. And you will see movies about that, and it's used by religion to suggest that we are different from all other species because there was not a fossil that was able to attach our pathway of evolution to the pathway of evolution of all other species. This discovery turned out to be massive because this is the missing link now that was able to connect this branch of evolution of us to the evolution of all other species. The name of this guy was called Ida. There is a very cool article about Ida in YouTube, and I recommend you to have a look at it because I find it mind-blowing that this one guy was, again, standing on the wall of somebody being framed until somebody saw it. Once they discovered the significance of this fossil, the fossil was sold for $1 million. Can you imagine that thing? You having a frame on your house that is worth $1 million and you didn't even know. Again, going back to my original class about this thing of critical observation, like you get to know how important things are. Again, as I point out, there is a very interesting video about this in YouTube. So I recommend you to have a look at it about Ida. Now, another thing that is pretty cool about the human evolution and something that it teaches about the evolution of all other species is this thing that we talked earlier about hybridization. When you had species that had diverged over time, they come together. The issue with hybridization, though, is that the offspring of hybrids are not viable, so they cannot reproduce. A different business is when lineages that are completely different, moving in different pathways, when they reproduce and their offsprings are viable. That is what is called admixture. Basically, when previously divergent or isolated genetic lineages mix. Humans are actually pretty crazy about this. I mean, the ancestors of us were used to have wild parties, so to speak, because it has been discovered that we actually interbreed a lot with different species of different species along our lineages. Like, for instance, this one here, this is the famous Neanderthals, and there is some genetic evidence to suggest that we actually, if you are white like me, white or Asian, it's very likely that in your genes today we had genes of the Neanderthals. So it turns out that back in the day, when humans left first Africa, they encountered the Neanderthals and they reproduced with them via this process of admixture. So a lot of genetic similarity between the genes of Neanderthals and a people that is located in the lower parts of Asia. Some genes found on people that is also from Europe. However, there is no similarity between the genetic makeup of the Neanderthals and people from Africa, which allowed them to conclude that this mixture, these guys having sex, did happen after we left Africa for the first time. Another example of us having wild parties back in the day is related to those guys here. These are called the Denisova. This is another lineage on the evolution of mankind, and it turns out that we also had some genes, the people from that parts of Asia had some genes in relation to that species. Again, just for you to realize that it's not always clear-cut. Once we branch out in evolution, that we become separated. There are several case examples in which we can come together, and in fact, we can produce offsprings that are viable. In that case, that will be called admixture. If the offsprings are not viable, that will be called hybridization. Now, that is over time, right? What I just showed you here, this is evolution over time. But one of the things that is missing in phylogeny is the space. Where is this happening in a space, right? So here I just give you an example of the migrations of these different lineages and how they sometimes came together and had sex and had admixture there. But this evolution also happens in a space, not only time, but in a space. As the species are originated, one of the things that they all do is they disperse and they colonize new places. So let's look at us or movement. So it turns out there is this thing called the Genographic Project. It's a fascinating project. You can see the infographics of it in National Geographic. And basically what they did here, they took the genetic samples of people, native populations from everywhere around the world today. And as I explained to you earlier, what they did, in this case, they look at the genetic similarities among those populations, and as a result, they didn't not only created the phylogeny, but they managed to match the pathways in which these populations went from one place to another, and they created again what is called the Genographic Project. It's a fascinating project describing the way that we left Africa. So let me just describe to you some interesting pathways of how we get to be where we are. There is this species called haplogroup L0. It's about 800,000 years old, and basically it's a genotype that was created in Africa, and I migrated northwards, but towards the west, right? There is another haplotype. This one here is about 80,000 years old. These guys, again, come from around the same place, but they moved towards Arabia, and that haplotype then led to the movement. These people that moved along this pathway led to a completely different haplotype that is called haplogroup M, that is about 60,000 years old, that colonized all of the lower parts of the lower Indo-Pacific and lower Indian Ocean. And this haplogroup, of course, made it all the way up to Australia. Now, you will think that it was only one way that we got out of Africa. It turns out that thanks to this project, we discovered that there were actually several times that we moved out of Africa. And the evidence is this other guy, which is a much younger haplogroup that again moved, that got out of Africa. And those guys actually diverged along two different pathways there. Then we had this haplogroup F. The age of that haplogroup is not very well known, but this is the one that ended up colonizing all of the Asian islands in the Pacific. We had this other haplogroup here, we just don't know. These are the ones that led to people like, most likely like people like you or me, the ones that colonized the part of Europe that ended up then moving to the United States and South America many centuries later. There is this other group, haplogroup A, is about 50,000 years old. These guys colonized in the northern parts of Europe. This one here, another colonization of Europe 35,000 years ago. These ones decided to move up north in Asia and all of the Siberian part, 15 years old. These are the guys now that start getting closer to the Americans, and eventually it got to a point where about 10,000 years ago, they finally crossed into the Americas. And it turns out that they were again different pathways, different times that we actually were able to cross through the Americas. And there, when you look at the genetic makeup of native human populations in the Americas, it turns out that there are two different haplogroups in this continent, suggesting again that there were at least two different times that we crossed from Asia into the Americas. And that now describes to you how we went from one place to another. And the other thing that I wanted to show here with these images is the beauty of the genetic makeup of people, same species trying to evolve or to adapt to specific environments. And you can imagine over time, if we were not able to cross to each other, these these different haplogroups eventually turning into different species. In the case of humans, of course, what happens with that is that you can imagine the degree of the capacity of us to migrate. You can see this thing over 100,000 years, we pretty much managed to just walk, because back in the day, there was no way for us to move, but basically we just walk an entire continent and actually colonize another one. So in the case of humans, that capacity to disperse kind of reduces the capacity of us turning into completely different species. But if we didn't have that capacity to disperse, it's very likely that the adaptation that results in these different phenotypes that you see here will over time lead to completely different species. Let me show you a couple other haplogroups that I find very interesting, again, on the patterns of migration. There is this haplogroup about 50,000 years old, again, originated in the upper part of the Indian Ocean, and I migrated all the way up to South America. This is the other haplogroup that I like very much. I was used to live in Australia back in the day, and it's interesting to see the pathway of migration that led to the people that colonized Australia. And this same haplogroup actually colonized a lot of the continent, all of the islands that were close to the continent along Asia, and eventually via that pathway, obviously you can imagine these people being very capable of navigation and things like that. Obviously they were easily capable of migrating into the Americas, and was one of the haplogroups that we see represented in the genotypes of populations along the Americas. Of course, there was a point in time in which we just managed to be everywhere. This is a satellite image of the world at night, and basically what you can see here is that today in this map, you can see where we are, and you can see that we are pretty much everywhere in the planet with the exception of the oceans, but pretty much anywhere in the planet where we can be, we are already there. Here is another example, again, of the craziness or the extent to which we managed to colonize the world. Obviously, our population also got to be very abundant. Not only we managed to go to places, but we also managed to increase in abundance. And here you can see the increase in the number of people, right? You can see, like, look, for thousands of years, our population was very small, and just in the last 1,000 years, we went from being like less than 1 billion to now having nearly 7 billion, and we could potentially easily reach 12 billion people by the end of the 2050s. Just as a reference for you, in this decade that just passed, we went from 7 billion people in 2011, which was 1 billion people more than was there 10 years ago, prior to that year. So what I point out there is that in a little bit more than 10 years, the world's human population increased by 1 billion people. Pretty much, you see the history of humanity, not in the first 10,000 years we reached 1 billion, and in the last decade we increased 1 billion in just 10 years. Now that I just explained to you this phylogeny, or this evolution of humanity, and how the species originate, they move, and as they move they adapt and they come back, you can imagine the mess that this creates as it comes down to a species, because that was just one, but imagine a lot of species doing that. So what you ended up with is something like this, where every one of these polygons that you see here is the pattern of the movements of one species, the geographical range where a species is present, and now you can imagine hundreds of species doing that simultaneously. So you can imagine the diversity of opportunities that this offers for a species to adapt and to diversify. So that evolution that we had discovered, and that we had described, and that was discovered by Darwin, is something that happens both in space and time. It's happening for many species, and of course the overlap of those individual cases results in patterns that then are the focus of the study of biogeography, and later on we're going to start looking at again these patterns. But what I want you to realize in advance when we start looking at these patterns is the fact that those patterns are again the result of evolution of individual species happening in space and time that basically coincide with many other species. So that's what I want you to from the angle that I want you to start looking at when we start looking at those patterns later on. That's the class for today. and I see you guys in the next episode.